Well, I've got my iced caramel latte with soy milk, of course. Don't come at me about soy. I will argue with you in the comments. I will. Now I started off the video by being contrarian. Let's talk about climate change. Such a happy topic. I wrote about 10,000 words and 22 pages of script for this video, so if I look off to the side, like over there, I'm just looking at my script. Don't take it personal. I finished the script about like an hour ago and I wanted to film it before I forget everything, but I did not learn it by heart. I think it was Sir David Attenborough who once said that climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time. He wasn't wrong. Over the past decade, climate change has increased drastically, and we as humanity are facing disaster if we don't change something fast. But there's not much time left, and it depends on us to change before time runs out and consequences are getting worse than they already are, and they're already said to be. Climate change causes extreme weather events. That is pretty much common knowledge at this point. I'm going to tell you how it does that, and I'm going to try to keep the science simple. Unfortunately, I don't have the time, energy, or motivation to explain absolutely every scientific aspect of climate change to you, but I'm going to try to keep it simple and easy. Basically, this is a brush up on extreme weather events. Let's get right into it. Let's talk about extreme weather events. Before we get into how and why this happens, we should define the term extreme weather events. So let's take a look at what the WMO, or World Meteorological Organization, defines as an extreme weather event. They say, an extreme weather event is rare at a particular place and time of year with unusual characteristics in terms of magnitude, location, timing, or extent. The characteristics of what is called extreme weather may vary from place to place in an absolute sense. Honestly, for us common fools, I think this is pretty confusing. It's just like something is happening, it's not usual, we don't know, but I can tell you who does know. Well, first of all, me, and also you in a moment, but for our intents and purposes, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, says weather-related extreme events are often short-lived and include heat waves, freezes, heavy downpours, tornadoes, tropical cyclones, and floods. That's easier to understand. They're naming examples. We know what these things are. If you can't define what a heat wave is, you still probably have a pretty good idea of what it means. It means it's pretty hot, but we'll get into that. Actually, we're getting into that right now. Heat waves dry out land, and they increase the risk of wildfire, which can spread and destroy forests and homes in its way. The extreme heat also causes health problems when people are being exposed to dangerous levels of it. The Royal Meteorological Society describes a heat wave as a prolonged period of excessively hot weather which has different definitions around the world relative to the average temperature and weather for specific locations. Lucky for us, they also have a pretty helpful article on what causes heat waves and how they work. Let's talk about heat domes. Do you know what a heat dome is? I didn't. Not until I researched this video. So there's a thing called a heat dome. You already grasped that. Heat domes are kind of like lids on a pot. They form when an area of high pressure is over the same place for days or weeks. They trap very warm air underneath them. So If you look at a pot with boiling water, put the lid on, and it heats up faster because the heat can't escape. Heat dome is the same thing for heat. Basically, the air will get hotter and hotter. This warm air will rise up into the atmosphere, but the high pressure pushes it back down, and the sinking air warms up even more. It warms up by a whole degree every 100 meters. So, over the distance of 1 kilometer, it warms up by 10 degrees. That is a lot. And if the air warms up, everything it touches and surrounds warms up as well. That means the ground, the plants, the animals, and the people. As the ground gets warmer, it loses moisture, and that makes it easier for the ground to heat up even more. It just heats up, and then it heats up more, and there's something that happens, and it causes it to heat even more. You have warm air. The warm air can't escape, it gets even warmer, it rises up because it's warm. Oh, it's so warm, it falls back down. Up, that makes it heat up even more. That dries out the ground, which makes it easier for the air to warm up. Until the pressure pattern changes, this will continue to happen in this cycle. It will just get hotter and hotter. Until then, there's a higher risk of wildfires, drought, and heat health issues. Climate change plays into this, of course. As the world in general warms up, the chance of very hot days and nights are increased. Now we need to look at some more science. Basically, there's a ribbon of air. It's very high in our atmosphere and it moves very quickly. This ribbon largely influences and controls the weather systems on the ground. But it's weakening due to a reduction in temperature contrast between the equator and the pole. And that's because Antarctica is heating up twice as fast as the rest of the world. And as these streams get weaker, they will buckle and meander, and this allows patterns of high pressure to become more dominant, which in turn allows heat waves to become more common. What's something that goes hand in hand with a heat wave? Droughts. By changing weather patterns and increasing the rate of evaporation, climate change also increases the chance and likelihood of droughts. Higher temperatures lead to more evaporation from land and water bodies. This means that soil will dry out faster, rivers and lakes shrink more quickly, and ecosystems are stressed. The consequences of this manifest in different ways. First of all, there's the impact of altered rainfall patterns. Climate change disrupts weather systems like the jet stream, which is the ribbon we just talked about, and monsoons. Some areas receive less rain. For example, the southwest United States have been experiencing a prolonged mega drought, which has worsened over about 1,000 years. A mega drought, not just a drought, it's a mega drought. What's worse than a drought? A mega drought. This situation is both linked to variability of the location and climate change. Of course it is. Droughts also affect agriculture. They reduce water availability for crops and livestock, which can lead to food shortages and higher food prices. Particularly in Africa, climate change is contributing to more frequent and severe droughts in regions like the Sahel, threatening millions of people with food insecurity. Actually, let's take a closer look at the Sahel. Water scarcity, soil degradation, and shortening growing seasons are reducing crop yields. So there's less food to go around. Agriculture in the Sahel is largely rain-fed, meaning it depends heavily on seasonal rainfall. This, for example, contrasts to other places where groundwater or rivers are largely used to keep the earth moist. When droughts occur, crops don't receive enough water. This results in lower yields and complete crop failure. Crop failure is when there's nothing. You have an entire field and you cannot harvest anything. I don't think I need to tell you that that's bad. As droughts dry out the soil in the area, they lead to the loss of topsoil, which in turn reduces the land's ability to support agriculture. So areas that were previously fertile are now barren and unable to produce crops. While it's possible to change these areas and put them back to fertile soil, it's not that easy, and it also doesn't happen automatically. Drought conditions also shorten the agricultural growing season. Farmers have less time to plant, grow, and harvest crops before the dry season returns. If you also think back to the heat waves and consider that people may not be able to work outside during the extreme heat, this leaves very little time, much less than previously, for farmers to produce food. There's also the matter of livestock death. Livestock farming is a crucial livelihood for many people in the Sahel. However, droughts reduce the availability of water, but not only that, they also reduce the availability of grazing land, which makes it very difficult to sustain herds. As droughts lead to the loss of grass and shrubs that livestock rely on for food, there's not enough grazing land. A consequence of this is malnutrition for the herds, and it's just more likely for them to die. So pasture depletion is another big issue. Additionally, there's water shortages to think about. Obviously, droughts cause water sources such as rivers, lakes, and wells to dry up, forcing communities to travel further to find water for their livestock. These things have serious impacts. With crop failure and livestock death, food production plummets, leading to shortages. This drives up food prices, making it difficult for vulnerable populations to afford basic staples like grain. As food becomes scarcer? Again, English is not my first language. As food becomes scarcer and less accessible, malnutrition rates rise, especially among children. As food becomes scarcer and less accessible, malnutrition rates rise, especially among children. Food storage shortages have contributed widespread hunger and a malnutrition crisis. This in turn impacts society as a whole in more ways than one. As parts of the Sahel become increasingly uninhabitable, people find themselves forced to move. They often end up migrating to urban areas or across borders. This mass migration puts pressure on already strained resources in the receiving areas. And the competition for already scarce resources like water and grazing land can lead to violent conflict between communities, particularly between farmers and herders. Droughts increase tension and increase the likelihood of conflict over access to essential resources. Looking at all of this, we need to understand that many countries have become dependent on international food aid to meet basic nutritional needs. While this aid helps in the short term, it does not address the long-term challenges posed by climate change. Wildfires. Psh, psh. I don't know why I said that like it's a nice thing. Wildfires are pretty bad. Oh my god, they're so scary. Do you remember, when was it? Like a few years ago, I think I have this in here as well, when like half of California was on fire? Genuinely, I think I've seen so many videos of people like having to leave their home because of the fire. Wildfires are so scary. I'm so glad that I live far away from regions that are prone to wildfire, because that stuff is terrifying. Like, I'm not kidding. Do you remember when, yeah, you definitely remember this, when that like gender reveal caused like a giant forest fire? Did you ever think about the fact that this forest fire might not have been as big if it wasn't for climate change? Let's talk about that. Hotter and drier conditions, both directly linked to climate change, are contributing to more frequent and intense wildfires. As warmer temperatures dry vegetation, it becomes more flammable. Oh my god. I wrote basically this entire script with like word dictation, and genuinely I don't think Word wrote the word drought once. Here it says rods. It's so hot in here, but I don't dare open the window because last night I had it open for a bit at night, and then I think a hornet flew in. I don't know if it was a hornet. It was like this giant insect. It was like this long, and like the front half was like black, and then the back half was like yellow and black striped. It was so big and it was so loud, and I like closed the living room door and called it a day. And then this morning, I guess it flew out. I don't know. I haven't seen it since, but I'm keeping the window closed, and it's so hot. Probably like flushed as hell. Anyway, let's get back into it. No, not. As warmer temperatures dry out vegetation, it becomes more flammable. When this is combined with droughts and altered rain patterns, it creates a perfect coordination for large-scale fires. Additionally, changing wind patterns also contribute to the immense spread of these fires. Overall, perfect conditions if you're a wildfire, really bad conditions if you're literally anything else. As if it wasn't crazy enough that there is such a thing as fire season in the United States, Australia, and the Mediterranean, these fire seasons are also starting earlier and lasting longer than before. Firefighters are doing their absolute best, fighting at the forefront. But their job is made harder by climate change. Quite a bit harder. Not only does fire season last longer, but wildfires are becoming more intense. They're burning more land at higher temperatures, which makes them harder to control and more destructive. Australia's 2019 to 2020 bushfire season was one of the most severe on record, fueled by record-breaking heat and prolonged drought. But not only do wildfires destroy habitats, they also cause significant air pollution, leading to health problems for millions of people. Smoke from wildfire in the USA and Canada causes poor air quality as far as over here in the European Union. That's crazy. They're like so far away. Genuinely, I think we're so used to having like Sahara sand here in Germany. That's like normal. I don't know why, but that's like a normal thing for us. I remember the first time I joined a European Parliament session, like a simulated European Parliament session. Obviously, I have not attended a real one. And everyone rose for the hymn of the European Parliament. You know what else is rising? Sea levels. This was a terrible, terrible transition. I don't know why I made a joke about this. It's actually pretty tragic. Anyways, the planet's sea level has been stable for thousands of years. Now they're rising. Is that good? Do you think it's good? No, obviously it's not. It's bad. Rising sea levels are a huge issue. They're basically a humanitarian nightmare because due to rising sea levels, many humans, animals, plants, and just nature in general will suffer and are suffering. Why did I put that in the future tense? That doesn't make any sense. Oh my god, that rhymes. I should rhyme more lines. Rising sea levels. Rising sea levels are a huge issue. They're basically like a humanitarian nightmare. They're also an environmental nightmare. They're just a nightmare for everyone. Probably thinking, woo, more ocean. No, more ocean is bad. It's really bad. Because more ocean means less land, and less land means less space for people to live. But we will get into that. Actually, we're getting into that right now. Because rising sea levels are displacing people from their homes. A couple of places are especially affected by this, like the South Pacific. so Indonesia and Bangladesh. Those two countries have already been affected by climate change. But talking about Asian countries is not very effective when talking to European people, because why would you care about climate change over there and how people are losing their homes? You don't care. I'm gonna tell you what you do care about. Louisiana. You wanna know why? Because it's in the US of A. Editing, can you insert like that, like my pronouns are US and A, please? I will give you like a nice kiss if you do. Louisiana is losing a football field's worth of ground every 45 minutes. Can you imagine that? Imagine that more than once an hour, an entire football field worth of space will disappear. Now, I have this information from the Sir David Attenborough documentary that came out in 2019 on BBC about climate change. And they did not specify whether it was European or American football fields. So I looked up the sizes of both because they're not the same size. An American football field is 5,350 square meters, and a European football field is 4,050 square meters. Can we just talk in actual units of size? Like, can we stop comparing stuff to other stuff? Like, I don't know how much this is anyway, but I also don't know how big a football field is. Also, there's like 1,000 square meters of difference. Why would you do this to me? Seriously. I didn't look up, to be honest, which one it is. I can tell you it's a lot. I don't need to look that up. This landmass that's disappearing is not just empty land. It's not even just uninhabited nature. Climate change is actively, in the USA, nowadays, at this very moment, displacing people from their homes. Take a quick lip gloss break. Do you have some water? Did you drink some water yet today? Should drink some water. Okay, lip gloss break over. I hope you got some water. Let's talk about something that you probably don't think about a lot when it comes to climate change. Let's talk about climate refugees. You've probably heard that. And just now we talked about people in Louisiana losing their homes, people in Bangladesh losing their homes. Once again, you can't relate to them as much, which is weird because it's like not that much further away from where I am than the US. I should probably cut out the part where I say you don't care about people in Asia. But given that I'm mostly sending this video to people I know, which are very Central European people, I don't think it's wrong. Climate refugees is not a term that's been clearly defined. But it should be, because it not being clearly defined is an issue, but it's really hard to define it. Let me tell you why. First of all, you probably would assume that this is just a thing that you can go to your favorite search engine and you look up climate refugee definition, and then whichever governmental organization you go to your definitions for. Personally, I always look up European Union, and I had a bit of an issue with that. Climate refugees are refugees, in my opinion. But they're not fleeing from war or bad economy or other things that people have in the past typically flown from. They're fleeing from the effects of climate change. The issue with this is, of course, that climate change is affecting the entire world, and you can't simply be free from climate change. You can flee from areas affected the most, but you're never gonna get to an area anywhere on this entire planet that's not affected by climate change. But let's get back to the question: what's a climate change refugee? Like I said, it's surprisingly hard to answer this question. In 2023, the European Parliament Research Service, which is a service that you should look up more papers from, they're very interesting. Just as a side note, they're always a great resource, except for this. in which case they're a good resource who can tell me why there's nothing. Anyways, in 2023, the European Parliament Research Service published a paper, which was an updated version of a briefing from October 2021. And this briefing is titled "The Concept of Climate Refugees Towards a Possible Definition." And the entire thing is basically about the fact that it's really hard to define a climate refugee. Why? Yeah, you'd think it's easy? I think it's easy. But is it? Why is it so hard? Honestly, why is it hard? I could probably come up with a very vague and simple definition for a climate refugee on the spot. A climate change refugee is someone who has to leave their home, city, place, country, whatever, and move somewhere else to escape from uninhabitable conditions caused by climate change. That sounds simple. But let's take a look at what I just said. I think there's a good chance you agree with what I just said, but it's not really something that a government can work with. My nose is getting stuffy, and I think my voice is getting worse. Again, I'm sorry about this. I have been coughing for 4 weeks. I don't know if I said that yet. I have, and it's not getting better. And if I get a cold on top tonight, I'm gonna be so mad. And if you're watching this and you want to comment, Simone, go to the doctor. I'm gonna call my doctor tomorrow. By the time you're seeing this video, I will have called my doctor. I will have an appointment. Maybe by the time you're watching this video, I will have had my appointment and my voice is back to normal. For now, I'm gonna be talking for like 2 more hours. So yeah, I hope you don't mind too much because it's probably not getting better. A correct and specific definition of the term climate refugee would offer legal protection and the opportunity for governments to help climate refugees. But without a definition, governments and international bodies struggle to identify who is eligible for support, which could lead to inconsistent or unfair treatment of displaced individuals. The term displaced individuals basically describes people who don't have a place to go for some reason or another. For example, after the Second World War, there were a lot of displaced persons in Europe because they didn't have a home to go back to. Same with climate refugees. I don't know if that was a terrible comparison. It's just like that's what a displaced person is. And the big issue with this definition is how hard it is to prove that something happened because of climate change. People move for various reasons: economic hardship, armed conflict, persecution, environmental disasters, and gradual environmental degradation. Without specific facts, people displaced by slow onset events like desertification, so when a place dries out, basically turns into a desert, might be treated differently from those fleeing sudden disasters like hurricanes, even though both are caused by climate change. A vague definition would result in inconsistent policy responses and legal protections. And that just means people not getting the help they deserve and need. I've just used a lot of very difficult words and I didn't explain all of them, so let me put it simply. If we don't come up with and agree on one definition of climate refugee, there might be people who are victims of climate change, who might not get the help that they deserve and need. When I say policy responses and legal protections, I mean things like laws that allow people to get refugee status in another country or another place. So if, for example, there's desertification happening in the south of Italy, which, by the way, just means that for a long time there's very little rain, leading to land drying out, which eventually means nothing will grow there even if it rains. Desertification like that doesn't happen overnight, but it is and can be a consequence of climate change. So the people who then would live in this uninhabitable land might just be too hot and too dry to genuinely be able to provide for the people living there. What? That is not a sentence. I'm also only on page 7. Desertification takes a long time, and it's really hard to prove that what is happening to people affected by it happened because of climate change. We've gone over that already. Let me remind you of a fact that climate change deniers and people who don't want to help out others will probably use against you, but you need to know it anyway. No one, not the smartest scientists in the world, not the best scientific models, can prove without a doubt that something happened due to climate change. Things are more likely to happen due to climate change, but it's often not the only factor involved. And that just means it's really hard to define events caused by climate change, especially if we're talking about things like desertification. At the end of the day, all that we would realize is that it's really hard to figure out whether something was caused by climate change. And yet we do need this definition. Because having a specific definition like that is crucial in determining who's responsible for assisting displaced individuals. Once again, people who don't have a place to go to. Is it the international community? Is it a country of origin, or is it a receiving country? It really depends. An accurate definition helps ensure that nations contributing most to climate change have to take responsibility for the people displaced by it, which means that if, for example, Bangladesh, which is already and will be even more affected by climate change, but has not had as big of a role in causing it, should not be on its own in helping the people affected by climate change effects. In helping those that have to leave their homes because they cannot stay there any longer, because of something that neither them nor their ancestors have done, people like me from more privileged nations and privileged lives are just doing what we have to. But unfortunately, we kind of have to be forced to. A clear definition also helps humanitarian aid and resource allocation, because unfortunately there is not unlimited amounts of money that we can allot to just helping people, because that would just be too easy. We need to spend money on wars, don't forget. We need to make more billionaires. They have to be paid. That money can't be used to help victims of climate change. It has to stay in some billionaire's bank account. Don't be silly. So a clear definition allows humanitarian organizations and governments to properly allocate resources. If the definition is too broad, it might lead to misallocation of aid, which potentially diverts resources away from those people most affected by climate change, which would just be another tragedy. Or in other words, if we mess up the definition and we make it too broad or we make it too narrow, bad. Having a good definition is also really, really important for long-term planning, because it would allow governments to project future migration trends, which means from where will people go to where when? So who will need help when and where? Misidentifying or overgeneralization. Misidentifying or overgeneralizing can lead to inaccurate forecasts, which constrain services like housing, healthcare, and social welfare systems and destination countries, which then again would be bad for everyone. The people coming in and the people already there. Also, climate change is just really, really complicated. There are multiple possible causes of displacement. In fact, one of the biggest challenges in defining climate change refugee as a word is that climate change often interacts with other factors, such as economic conditions, political instability, and conflict. Almost no refugees migrate only because of climate factors, and displacement is often the result of multiple overlapping stressors. For example, drought might make pre-existing poverty even worse, which leads to migration. But attributing this poverty solely to climate change is difficult and often not the entire truth. Then there's the difference between sudden and slow onset events. Climate change causes both of them. Sudden events like hurricanes and floods, and slow events like the rise of sea levels and desertification. These types of events affect people differently, and they cause displacement over varying time frames. Defining climate refugee. In defining the term climate refugee, we must account for both immediate displacement and gradual migration due to environmental degradation. So those are two very, very different groups of people, both of whose refugee status is technically caused by the same thing, but also very different at the same time. Climate change also impacts different regions in different ways, and not all people affected by it are displaced. In some cases, people can adapt to environmental changes, and they can remain in place, while in others they may be forced to move. If we look at the situation in Louisiana, these people have to move. But this makes it really difficult to create a one-size-fits-all definition of climate refugee, because we as humans are defined by our ability to survive literally anywhere. I mean, you can't forget that there have been people living in Antarctica for I don't know how long. There are people living in deserts. There are people living right next to volcanoes. And there have been groups of people like this for basically as long as humanity existed. So not everyone whose life is extremely affected by climate change will be a climate refugee. But that doesn't mean that they don't also need help. So maybe we need to create a second term for those staying behind. At the end of the day, there's not really anything that you or I could define that distinguishes them. But at the end of the day, there's not really an easy way to figure out whether someone will stay behind or move, as it's often a very personal thing. Let's take a look at one of those places with already extreme weather. Let's take a look at one of those places where there's already pretty extreme weather. Let's take a look at the Arctic, or specifically the Inuit and Sami peoples. Most of them are located in the Arctic regions of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and northern Scandinavia. The Arctic experiences extreme cold, with temperatures often dropping below minus 40 degrees in the winter. I'm sorry, I just have to. Minus 40 degrees. Do you know how much I whine when it's like minus 11? When it's minus 11 degrees, I will put on like 4 layers of sweaters and a fur coat, and I will only wear like real wool. And then I will layer it with polyester, because polyester heats up and wool keeps the heat in. Minus 40 degrees. And that's insane. Sorry. These regions also have long periods of darkness during the winter months and 24-hour daylight during the summer. Genuinely, to me, that does not sound like a place that's livable for humans. And yet, indigenous groups have lived there for thousands of years. They've adjusted to the cold by developing specialized clothing and using igloos or other isolated shelters. Nowadays, obviously, most people live in built houses. But people have always made it work. Nowadays, this way of living is of course endangered by climate change, and it will not be possible for much longer. It's barely possible now. Back to the issue with the definition of climate refugee. Here's a quote from Isabel Borges, a professor and researcher at the Norwegian Business School and University of Oslo. The absence of an accurate definition of what constitutes as a person displaced by environmental factors has resulted in the inability to measure exactly the number of existing and potential displacement flows. Sums it up perfectly, in my opinion. So we've talked about most of this before, but let me translate it back into simple English again anyways. Because we don't have a good definition for climate refugees, we don't really know how many climate refugees there are. Did you get that? We've talked about most of these terms, but let me translate it back into simple English anyway. Because we don't have a good definition of climate refugee, we don't really know how many climate refugees there are, where they come from, and where they will go. That means we can't properly help them where the issue is. That means we can't properly help them in the places where the issues lie. We can't expect them in the places they will go to, and we can't help them on the way there. Long story short, not having a clear definition of climate refugee is basically bad for everyone involved, start to finish. And that's not even all there is to say about the term. Because originally the term climate refugee was found to be incorrect, and not just by anyone. The UNHCR, that's the United Nations Refugee Agency, they said, we don't want anything to do with this thing of climate refugees. They're not refugees according to us. Now, obviously that's not because they didn't want to help them. But they say it blurs the boundaries between the definition of refugees that everyone agreed on in 1951 and popular concepts regarding refugees. Now, obviously, that's not because they don't think that people who are displaced or migrate due to climate factors are refugees or deserving of help. Their issue is that they are worried that using the term climate refugee will blur the lines between what the 1951 convention defined as a refugee and what is a modern concept of refugee. These lines are already blurred, and they're very worried about this getting worse. The EU briefing that I've talked about previously also mentions Diana Ionesco, who in 2019 was the head of the Migration, Environment and Climate Change Division at the IOM. She said that calling climate refugees could make things worse for those people who are refugees according to the 1951 Refugee Convention, and also make it harder for climate refugees to get help if they're unable to prove that they're actually fleeing due to the climate. And yes, obviously to a certain degree, I absolutely agree with her. When Ionesco worries that this will make things harder for people who are already considered refugees, she most likely is correct. I mean, that's literally her job. But I would argue that having a proper definition of climate refugee and calling them refugees would make it easier for climate displaced people to get aid and support. She says the issue is that they can't prove it. And that is a big issue indeed, but that doesn't mean that they're not refugees. Now, why is there an issue with the UNHCR and climate refugees? The answer to that question might be found in the UNHCR's description of what a refugee is. I'm going to use the text that the UNHCR has on their website below the title, Who is a Refugee? So we're going to use that as their definition. Refugees are people forced to flee their country and seek safety in another country. They are unable to return to their own country because of feared persecution as a result of who they are, what they believe in or say, or because of armed conflict, violence, or serious public disorder. And if we look at that, their issue is pretty obvious. The UNHCR pretty much only defines people as refugees if they are fleeing from other people. And while climate change was caused by humans, people fleeing from its effects are not directly fleeing from a government or a war or anything like that. They are fleeing from nature in a way. I mean, yeah. And that's probably the biggest issue with the definition of climate refugee. The fact that the definition of refugee is already widely debated. It is a term that we use colloquially, as well as academically. But there's a lot of different definitions for it, and not all of them are the same or even similar. Now, if we add environmental factors to this, we make it even more confusing for governments. Obviously, that doesn't mean we shouldn't define climate refugees. That just means we maybe need multiple definitions for different aspects. So while we might continue to use climate refugee colloquially, there might be different names for it depending on whether someone is staying behind or fleeing, and whether they are affected by a sudden event or a slowly developing one. I don't think I'm very centered. Okay, I've gotten a bit more comfortable because... Do you want to know a fun fact? Antarctica holds about 60% of the world's ice. No. It's not... It's not the fun fact. That's not true. I don't know if that's true. I have no idea if that's true. Hey, do you want to know a lie? Do you want to know something that's absolutely not true? I'll tell you what is true. Antarctica holds about 60% of the world's fresh water in its ice. And if all of that ice melted, global sea levels could rise by meters and meters. Okay, it's not a fun fact either. It's kind of a terrifying fact. Terrible, terrifying fact. The poles are warming 2 or 3 times faster than the global average. This is called polar amplification. Because the Antarctic Peninsula has warmed by about 2.5 degrees over the last 50 years, it's one of the fastest warming regions on Earth. Southern ocean temperatures around Antarctica are rising about 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade, which is significant for ice shelf melting. And Antarctica, I'm looking at you less and less. If you're not looking at the screen, don't start now. If you are looking at the screen, I'm sorry. I'm trying to hold eye contact. It's not working. I don't know why I did that motion. Antarctica is losing ice at an ever-increasing rate. 150 billion tons of ice are lost every year. How crazy is that? I think that's terrifying. 150 billion tons of ice. Genuinely, I don't know how much 1 ton is. Like, to me, that's just like an unimaginably big number. And maybe I could compare this to swimming pools. I definitely could. The thing is, if you tell me like 300 swimming pools, I also can't imagine that. So we're just gonna stick with more ice than you could possibly imagine. It's melting. Now, it doesn't... Since the 1990s, Antarctica's ice melt has contributed about 7.6 millimeters to global sea levels. That doesn't sound that bad. But remember about what I told you if all of that ice melts. Yeah. Ice shelves act as barriers. They're slowing the flow of glaciers into the sea. But warmer ocean water is melting them from below. And major glaciers are retreating rapidly. They're losing ice at speeds of up to 2 kilometers per year. Is there anything else that's like 2 kilometers per year? Like a snail? Is there like snail speed? Let me look that up. How fast is a snail? I don't know. Okay, a snail does 0.048 kilometers per hour. How many hours in a year? was number 8,760. $8,760 times, where's the little star? What did I say? 0.048, something like that. A snail is like 200 times faster than a glacier. Which makes sense because you can like see snails move and glaciers, you really. Yeah, I just took a break, like a 30-minute break, to make 2 unrelated or barely related Instagram reels. I'm probably not gonna put them in here. Did I even press play? I just rewatched some of the footage and my voice is terrible, and so I'm very sorry about that. I hope you're still watching. Okay, well, let's get straight back into it. I'm gonna cut all of this out anyway. So, fresh water from melting ice in Antarctica is reducing the levels of salt in the Southern Ocean. That, in turn, could potentially slow down important currents, like the AMC, which regulates the global climate. So, no big deal. It's just like climate change making climate change worse. It's a pattern that's repeating, isn't it? And it's terrible, but it's what happened. Anyways. Warm air can hold more moisture, which leads to increased snowfall in some areas of Antarctica. That sounds like good news for once. But it's not enough to counterbalance all the melting ice. So it's, penguin populations are declining in some regions because there's a lot less sea ice and there's less food available. So not only is the water warmer, there's less ice, the entire global climate is affected. Cute little penguin babies are also starving. Genuinely, what are we doing at this point? And we haven't even talked about polar bears. We're gonna talk about polar bears. You're not gonna enjoy when we talk about polar bears, because I know I'm not gonna enjoy when we talk about polar bears. But now we know that cute little penguin babies are starving. It would be tragic if they weren't cute, but they are cute. Polar vortex disruptions. Does anything rhyme with that? No. Okay, this is gonna sound weird after everything I've said so far, but climate change doesn't just cause temperatures to rise. It also causes extreme cold spells in North America, Europe, and Asia. Because of course it does. I'm gonna tell you why, because I know this is gonna sound super weird, but also remember, I think it was Donald Trump who was like, well, it's really cold, so climate change isn't real. First of all, you would be talking about global warming in that case, and second of all, it is still incorrect. The Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the planet. The jet stream is weakened. So basically, the thing that normally keeps the polar vortex, massive cold air, confined to the Arctic is not doing its job anymore. The polar vortex dips southward, bringing unusually cold weather with it to lower latitudes. Okay. Lovely. Just when we thought there would be no cold winters anymore and it's bad for everything else, it would at least be nice for us for a while, right? Like, I wouldn't miss not having to explain to people every winter that no, my fur coat is actually secondhand from my aunt. No, I would not buy fur. I'm vegetarian. But throwing it away would be worse for the environment, and also it's the only thing that keeps me from like losing a limb. That's not true. Not in the climate where I live. But let me be dramatic. Anyways, so you would think, oh, global warming, winters aren't that bad, everything is mild, at least in winter, and then in summer it gets hot, but at least winter is nice, right? Let me tell you about something called cold snaps. Overall, winters are getting warmer because of climate change, but polar vortex disruptions lead to cold snaps in regions that are not accustomed to such cold weather. In February 2021, there was a cold wave in Texas that caused temperatures to plunge to historic lows, which in turn caused broad, widespread power outrages. Yeah. Not only that, but it's also not as easy to define seasons anymore, at least not in the way we previously did. Because climate change is causing this immense weather variability. Winter can swing between periods of unseasonal warmth and deep cold. This might allow us to temporarily get our summer dresses out in March, but it also forced me to wear sweatpants and a hoodie in August. I just wanted to have a nice August morning, but now in September, if I put on a hoodie and sweatpants in the morning, I would melt. So it's just all over the place. It's like you can't really say like, oh, once you first put on like the hoodie and the sweatpants in the morning, from then on it gets colder, because I'm back to summer dresses and I don't enjoy it. Well, I mean, I love the summer. Are you enjoying this so far? Are you enjoying talking about all the terrible ways our weather is affected? I hope you are, because we're now going to talk about hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. Tropical storms draw energy from the warm water in the oceans. Climate change is causing ocean temperatures to rise, and that just provides more fuel for these storms. That leads to stronger winds, heavier rainfall, and higher storm surges. In addition to that, because that's not enough, the higher sea level makes coastal flooding worse when storms hit. Climate change impacts storms in multiple ways. One way is the strength. The intensity of hurricanes is increasing. More storms are reaching category 4 and 5 stages. In 2019, Hurricane Dorian devastated parts of the Bahamas, and scientists came to the conclusion that the unusually warm water temperatures of the Atlantic helped the storm reach its record-breaking strength. Hurricanes are also producing more rainfall due to the increased moisture in the atmosphere. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey dropped over 60 inches of rain in parts of Texas, making it the wettest tropical cyclone. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey dropped over 60 inches of rain in Texas. That makes it the wettest tropical cyclone in US history, with climate change, of course, contributing to the magnitude of the event. Let's talk about fauna. Fauna is a fancy word for animal. You probably know the term fauna and flora. Plants and animals, fauna and flora. Well, fauna is animals. It's just fancy, like a fancy way to say it. And as is to be expected, climate change makes life worse for the world's animals. It makes it worse through rising temperatures, changing weather patterns, habitat changes, and altered food availability. Species are either forced to adapt and move away, or they're facing extinction. Do you mind if I have an ice here while we finish this up? No? Good. Also, finishing up is a very broad term. We're like halfway through. But let's talk about temperature stress. Most animals have adapted to a specific range of temperature. Obviously, temperatures are rising because of climate change, because of global warming. But animals kind of struggle to survive in temperature ranges that they're not adapted to, which makes sense because they're not adapted to them. But that leads to stress, reduced reproduction rates, and in extreme cases, death. Yeah, I didn't have a joke to make about that. It gets pretty grim for a while. Habitats like forest grasslands and wetlands either shrink or shift into other kinds of habitats. Species that live there have to move to cooler areas or higher altitudes. But not all of them can adapt fast enough. And these higher altitudes are usually already inhabited by other animals. Animals have to deal with a lot of conflict around food and other resources that they need to survive because there's already animals there. And I think you've probably already grasped that resources are kind of shrinking everywhere. As temperatures rise and rain patterns change, plant growth, insect populations, and the availability of prey are affected as well. This disrupts food chains. Many species also rely on seasonal cues for breeding, migration, and hibernation. Climate change alters the timing of the seasons, as we've just talked about. It changes the way seasons work and when temperatures change. For example, spring now comes earlier in a lot of places, but there might be a wave of coldness after. This causes a mismatch in timing for breeding and food availability. I don't need to tell you that that's bad. And of course, the increased amount of CO2 is causing oceans to warm and acidify, which then in turn affects marine life like corals, fish, and shellfish. If you've heard literally anything about climate change, you know that our corals are in danger, that they are bleaching and dying off, and that we really, really need them to stay alive. On this note, let me remind you to only buy coral-friendly sunscreen. I don't care where you're going. I don't care if you're not going into the ocean, if you're not going into a water source, just buy coral-friendly sunscreen. But let's look at a more specific example. Let's take a look at everyone's favorite almost extinct animal, the polar bear. I mean, we have to talk about them while they still exist, right? I genuinely think that in maybe just a couple decades, maybe less, we're gonna have to find another example because polar bears will just be extinct because of us. Polar bears are one of the most popular examples when it comes to explaining how climate change is affecting animals. And climate change is really, really affecting their chances at survival. Polar bears rely on sea ice as a platform to hunt seals, which are their primary food source. They need ice to travel and to wait near breathing holes where the seals surface. But global temperatures are rising, and as we've already discussed, the Arctic sea ice is melting at insanely fast rates. So the summer ice cover is shrinking, and the ice is forming later in the year and melting earlier. Sea ice disappears, and polar bears are forced to swim longer distances to find food and shelter. This can lead to exhaustion, drowning, and again, death. Not only that, but polar bears have fewer opportunities to hunt for seals. As the ice-free season is increasing by about 5 days per decade, polar bears have less time to hunt and less chance to build fat reserves. Now, 5 days per decade doesn't sound a lot, except it really is, because it's half a day every year where there's no ice. That's quite a bit. It's like 12 hours with no ice, and that's like terrible math. Now our beloved polar bears are spending more time on land. But this is the place for them where food is scarce. Just like with other animals, that results in lower reproduction rates, malnutrition, and increased mortality, especially for cubs. Polar bears are trying to adjust and do something about this, but they are bears. They're changing their behavior and they're moving closer to human settlements in search of food, which increases the risk of human-wildlife conflict. Some bears are forced to remain on land during the ice-free months. Some polar bears are forced to remain on land during the ice-free months, where they face a lack of food and increased competition with other bears. Scientists estimate that if the current rate of ice melt continues, polar bear population could decline by up to 30% by 2050, which, funnily enough, is the year that the European Union hopes to be CO2 neutral by. So clearly that's perfectly on time, because even if we do reach this goal, which we won't, it's basically too late for most of the polar bears. The loss of sea ice is pushing polar bears towards extinction, and they can't adapt fast enough to these rapid environmental changes. We're gonna have to stay on this terrible topic for a while. We're gonna get into something less sad in a bit, but bear with me for a bit longer. Polar bears are not the only animals facing extinction. There are 1 million species of both animals and plants currently at risk of extinction due to a combination of factors. By about 2100, 20 to 30% of all species are expected to be at an increased risk of extinction. And that number expects there to be only a global temperature rise of 2 degrees. So it's gonna be much worse. If the average global temperature rises by 4%, as many as 50% of species could face extinction or major decline in population by 2100. Especially vulnerable are amphibians, with around 40%, so almost half of all of them, already at risk of extinction. Coral reefs have a projection of 90% of them being extinct by 2050. As they're dealing with rising sea temperatures and ocean acidification, many marine species in general could go extinct, like many fish species, but also other marine organisms. And this is by the end of the century, which, sure, is over 70 years away, but that's like one human lifespan. In attempts to escape from the impact of climate change, many species are forced to migrate to cooler areas or higher altitudes due to climate change. But not all of them can migrate quickly enough or find suitable habitats, which again is an increasing extinction risk. Okay. Let's talk about something that's slightly less sad, but not really less sad. Sorry, it's the nature of the topic. It's not a happy topic. At least we'll still have plants, right? No, not really. Climate change, of course, has a huge impact on plant life around the world. Going on from now, I'm going to use the word flora a couple times. Flora is really just a fancy way to say plant or plant life. As usual, let's start with the rising temperatures. As the planet heats up, a lot of plant species are forced to go beyond their tolerance limits. Plants adapted to cooler climates may struggle to survive in warming environments. A good example, or should I just say a terrible example for this, are alpine plants, because they thrive in cold, high altitude environments. And so they're being pushed up to higher and higher elevations. However, obviously mountains aren't endlessly high. So eventually they're gonna run out of space, which will lead to potential extinction for multiple species. In some regions, warmer temperatures can extend the growing seasons, which allows plants to grow for longer periods. That sounds amazing at first. Obviously, it isn't, because nothing about climate change really is amazing. Every time we think, oh, well, at least there's one upside, it's never an upside. I'm sorry, if you ever hear anything about climate change, you think, hey, that's not so bad. It is. It's definitely gonna be. There's literally nothing positive about climate change. Well, so longer growing seasons sounds good. Maybe that can help us solve the food growing issues. Or maybe longer growing seasons disrupt ecosystems and lead to competition among species. So if we're looking at natural areas, we're back to having a big problem. Changes in rainfall patterns lead to increased droughts in many areas, which affects water availability for plants, just as it does for animals and humans. Without enough water, plants obviously struggle to grow, reproduce, and sustain themselves. For example, in the Mediterranean region, prolonged droughts have caused the widespread die-off of oak trees and other native vegetation due to water stress. And in other areas, heavy rainfall can and will lead to flooding, which then in turn waterlogs roots and prevents essential gas exchange, which eventually kills sensitive plant species. Temperatures change, and a lot of plant species are moving. They're changing their geographic ranges towards cooler areas, either to higher latitudes or higher elevations. But plants don't have legs that they can just get up on and walk away, and those of them that cannot move as quickly or find a suitable habitat are at risk of extinction. The boreal forests, which dominate cold northern regions, are shifting towards the Arctic as the climate warms. But this migration doesn't only affect the plant species, but also the animals that depend on them as ecosystems. As there are higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, the rate of photosynthesis increases for some plants. This is usually called the CO2 fertilization effect, another term learned. It leads to faster growth for certain species like trees and shrubs. Poison ivy, for example, is growing faster and produces more toxic oils in response to higher CO2 levels, which has consequences for ecosystems and human health. But with some plants growing faster, their nutrition quality often declines. High CO2 levels can reduce the concentration of essential nutrients, like nitrogen, in plants. This affects herbivores and agriculture. This in turn affects herbivores and agricultural crops. Do you remember when I talked about wildfires and how I talked about wildfires destroying lots of forests and other plants? Yeah, just remember that. But in addition, the more intense storms can uproot entire trees, strip leaves, and cause severe physical damage to vegetation. In some areas, the early blooming of flowers due to warmer spring is causing a timing mismatch with the arrival of migratory birds and the insects that should pollinate these flowers. Because climate change alters the timing of flowering and seed production, it just leads to a mismatch between plant and their pollinators. When I talk about invasive species, what comes to your mind? Probably an animal. Maybe it's those like American squirrels that are invading Europe. Well, climate change also creates amazing conditions for invasive plant species, which outcompete native plants for resources. One of those species is kudzu, a fast-growing invasive vine, which is spreading in parts of the United States due to warmer temperatures. and it's choking out native plants by blocking sunlight. And then there's the fact that warmer temperatures and milder winters allow pests and diseases to survive and spread more easily, which damages plant life, because of course it does. The mountain pine beetle is really devastating pine forests in North America. With warmer winters, beetle populations thrive. Beetle populations thrive in the warmer winters caused by climate change, which in turn kills millions of trees across vast areas. The Amazon rainforest. It's a popular example to describe how climate change affects flora on a large scale. It's a popular example because it's one of the world's most important and biodiverse ecosystems. The Amazon is critical for regulating the entire planet's climate, but it's highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. The Amazon rainforest is experiencing more frequent and severe drought, which stresses rainforest plants. Many tree species in the Amazon are not adapted to prolonged dry periods, which leads to tree mortality. Trees that can't withstand drought are dying, reducing the Amazon's capacity to act as a carbon sink. Acting as a carbon sink is just a fancy way to say that it absorbs a lot of CO2. Instead, dying trees, which previously stored carbon, release it back into the atmosphere, and that also obviously causes global warming to get worse, because global warming causes global warming to get worse by getting worse. You know what I mean? Global warming exists, and then something happens, and that thing makes it worse, which makes it worse, which makes it worse. And I think my hand is out of frame now. The rainforest is legendarily wet. People go there and they get wet because it's the rainforest, right? But if you combine droughts with deforestation, you have an area that's more susceptible to wildfires. Those fires obviously destroy vegetation, but they also alter the composition of plant species. So, how many of which kind of plant are there? As fires become more common, the Amazon risks transitioning from a rainforest into an ecosystem more similar to a savanna, and which would significantly alter the plant biodiversity of our planet. Higher levels of CO2 are causing Amazonian trees to grow faster, but they also die younger. This rapid turnover reduces the ability to store carbon in the long term. Climate change impacts the world's flora in a lot of ways. From temperature stress to shifting habitats to wildfires, droughts, and disrupting pollination. Even though the changes are different based on region and species, plants are generally highly vulnerable to rapid changes occurring in their environment. In ecosystems like the Amazon rainforest, these changes have global implications, affecting biodiversity, climate regulation, and the overall health of the entire planet. Do you use a bamboo toothbrush? Have you changed to solid shampoo, conditioner, and face wash yet? I hope you're going to work by bike, because you really shouldn't take the car. And don't take the bus. The bus has higher emissions than a train. Anyways, take the train. Don't go by plane. I hope all of your clothing is secondhand, except if you want to get rid of old clothing, don't donate it and don't throw it away. That's bad for the environment. If you can't sell it, well, that's too bad. You have to be perfect. Do you ever use single-use containers? You shouldn't. A phone? Do you know how bad that is for the environment? No phone? How do you stay up to date with environment news? Are you wearing polyester? Are you throwing away polyester? Are you trying to replace the polyester you have? You know that's plastic, right? Don't use real leather or fur, that's bad for the environment, but don't use vegan leather or fur because that's just plastic. Don't build new houses because building new houses is bad, but also don't live in old houses because old houses are bad. Don't you dare buy a new car. I don't even have to tell you how bad that is for the environment, but don't you dare buy a used car because do you know how bad those are? Having a dog is bad for the environment, you know that, right? Having a cat is bad for the environment. Have you been outside lately? You know, if you wear shoes with rubber soles, that plastic is just going into the groundwater. You're an environment sinner. Whatever you do is not good enough. There's a lot of things that we are told to do in order to reduce global warming, and there are a lot of things that we can very easily do so. The more privileged we are, the more resources we have, the easier it is for us to switch to a more environmentally conscious lifestyle. But even if all of us do all of these things, we'll have a hard time saving the world. Part of that is, of course, because it's not possible for all of us to do all of these things right now. And yeah, individual actions are important. They're really important in the fight against climate change, but they on their own are not enough to address the scale and complexity of the crisis we're facing. Let's take a small look at why systemic changes involving corporations and large-scale institutions are crucial. If you've ever been in environment or leftist spaces, then you know that a very small number of corporations and industries contribute a significant portion of global greenhouse gas emissions. The top 100 fossil fuel companies have historically been responsible for about 70% of global emissions. Can you imagine that? Do you know how many companies there are? Let me just tell you, it's more than 100. So even if every single individual took extensive measures to reduce their carbon footprint, the overall impact would be relatively small compared to the emissions from those large-scale corporations. Especially those in the fossil fuel, automotive, and manufacturing sectors have immense economic power, and they also have a lot of influence. Their policies, their practices, and their investments determine the bulk of the world's carbon emissions. Corporations control significant financial resources that could be invested in clean energy, sustainable technologies, and innovation. A shift in corporate investments from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources could have a far-reaching impact on reducing overall emissions. So why is that not happening? Obviously, one of the reasons is greed, plain and simple. As long as there's money to be made without changing anything, there will be money made without changing anything. Many of the world's systems. I'm saying this following part at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but believe me, I'm not making this up. You can look all of this up on the internet, you will find credible sources for it. If you ask nicely, I'll even send you some credible sources. Many of the world systems, including energy production, transportation, and agriculture, are controlled by a few major players. Systemic changes in these areas require intervention at the corporate and governmental level. And as corporations often have the power to influence policies and regulations, these regulations must mandate significant No one tell my friends that I just blew my nose. I'm not sick. I'm like so healthy. I'm a horse. As corporations often have the power and money to influence policy and regulations, these regulations must mandate significant reductions in emissions and promote sustainable practices in order to be effective at climate action. Corporations need to be a part of this regulatory framework to ensure that compliance and large-scale change are happening. Obviously, this is easier said than done, because if it was as easily done as it is said, it would already have happened. Many large corporations operate globally and they have very complex supply chains. If you've ever looked into fairly or ethically produced products, you will realize that these supply chains are very confusing. They're purposefully confusing. So one individual's actions alone cannot influence the entire supply chain of a multinational company, because they span various countries and industries. So they must adopt and enforce sustainable practices throughout their entire supply chains, starting at sourcing raw materials that are responsible, resourcing waste, and ensuring that suppliers adhere to environmental standards. But hey, that's why we have innovation, right? Isn't it? Yeah. No, it is. I'm saying that like I don't mean it, but that is why we have innovation. I'm going to talk about something positive for a change. There are significant advantages in technology and innovation required to combat climate change. And these often come from corporate research and development efforts. I mean, they have to be financed somehow. Investment in these technologies, like carbon capture and storage or advanced renewable energy system, is primarily driven by corporations and governments. Corporations have the capability to scale up clean technologies quickly, while various individual efforts are limited in scope and reach. But let's get a bit more specific, because I've said corporations a lot. And that's easy. It's very easy, an us versus them mentality. Us little people, we can't do anything, but those corporations, like a cloud of corporations somewhere up there. What is a corporation? Any corporation? They're bad. We can't do anything. So let's name a couple. Major oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP are among the largest contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions. Raise your hand if you're surprised. Yeah, same. These companies are involved in extracting, refining, and selling fossil fuels, which are the primary source of carbon emissions. Lovely. So for meaningful climate action, they must transition to renewable energy sources. They must invest in cleaner technologies, and they must reduce their overall carbon footprint, which, if you're going to believe the rumors, is something that they invented anyway. So work on it, besties. To do this, they need to make significant changes to how they operate. They need to change their business practices and the way they produce energy, but also the things they invest their money in. What we've learned so far is that everything is bad and it's getting worse. And if you're feeling like me, you're kind of sad and frustrated right now. I've got a few ideas on how you and I can take action and do our part in trying to circumvent a disaster. But I'm also we'll get into it in a minute. For now, I have a couple suggestions. Yeah. Before I start, I know. I said personal actions don't make that much of a difference, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So, because they make a little bit of a difference, and a little bit of a difference is good. So maybe you and I can try to reduce our energy consumption. We can turn off lights and unplug electronics when we don't use them. Instead of putting our PCs in sleep mode, let's turn them off all the way. Have you ever been in a living room in the dark and you see like all the little LEDs lit up? Just like pull the plug. Bit of energy saved. It's gonna save you some money as well. It's lovely, right? And whenever we have to buy something new, maybe we can try to invest in energy efficient appliances and light bulbs. We can also avoid ACs in the summer and try to heat as little as possible in the winter. We can use public transportation, bikes, or adjust our feet to walk instead of driving whenever possible. If we have to take the car, maybe we can carpool with friends, so at least it's just one car instead of 5. And when we buy a new car, when we have to, we can buy electric or at least a hybrid car. We can take shorter showers and shower cold. This one, no. I know, I'm a person, I like to be comfortable. But I've gotten into cold showers and now I can't go back. I will never go back. Even if I'm taking a warm, cozy shower, first of all, that shower is lukewarm at this point. And also I have to finish it off with some cold water. Give it a try. Genuinely, give it a try. If you want to, there's lots of tips out there, but I think the most important thing if you want to try taking cold showers, there's lots of tips and tutorials out there, but honestly, the most important things are to ease into it. Start with lukewarm water and cooler water before you go straight to ice cold, and breathe out when you first step into the cold water or when it first hits your body. Trust me, it makes a difference. And don't be afraid to squeal a couple of times. When it's been a while for me with a cold shower and I go ice cold straight away, you can hear me screaming in the bathroom for like 2 seconds, and then I'm having the best time and I don't want to get out from the water. Ice cold showers are it. My hair is softer than before. We can practice reuse, reduce, recycle. We can avoid meat and dairy in our diets and buy locally produced and seasonal foods whenever possible. Maybe try meal planning. Maybe it works for you. It didn't for me. I didn't like it because I don't like food that's like 4 days old. But maybe it works for you. You know, there's lots of different things to try. Now I'm gonna rattle off a few ways that you can get involved in your community and try to do something good for the environment that way. Should I rap it? I'm not gonna rap it. Give me a beat. It's getting late. You can advocate for policy change by supporting and voting for policies and candidates that prioritize climate action. You can join or support local climate advocacy groups and campaigns. You can participate in public forums and discussions on climate policy. That one's especially important, because it is incredibly annoying to talk to like your I don't believe in climate change uncle, but if you just like don't talk to him ever again, I'm just gonna say it like this: never let an extremist feel like a martyr. Oh, no one likes me because I know the truth that climate change isn't real. Don't let them. Don't allow them to say that. And if you just talk to them because of that, because you don't, think they deserve to be like, oh no, fine. Bring up the topic in communities and social groups you're in. Not everyone can support and engage in climate activism, and that's okay. Don't shame yourself or others for doing small things or what looks to be very little activism. Did you say classism? I didn't, not yet. Did you know I was going to talk about that? Or did you come up with that yourself? Because a lot of the things I just said and which are commonly recommended to combat climate change, well, if you pay attention, they kind of reflect and reinforce class biases. Energy efficient upgrades and sustainable transportation are often pretty expensive. I think we've all seen videos where friends meet in other countries where they go by plane because it's cheaper to take the train for a couple hours, which is wild, but it's true. Personally, I have not been on a proper sleep train in over a decade, which isn't because I don't want to. It's because I don't even look into it because I know I couldn't afford it. I sleep sitting up in other trains, which does not make me more motivated to take trains. Energy efficient appliances, solar panels, and home insulation require significant upfront costs. Even though they might save you more money in the long run, often you have to pay more at first. Just another way that being wealthy saves you money, you know. Local and organic food is more expensive most of the time because it's local and organic and seasonal. And it's also kind of impossible to come by in very low income neighborhoods, let alone food deserts. I don't think I need to elaborate on that one. So let's move on to sustainable and ethically produced products. Have you ever looked at the prices for ethically produced products? I have. And I get it. These items have to be high priced because they're ethical. But also they're not really affordable for people who have to look at every euro. If a family has to decide between fairly produced towels and their kid's school trip, well, you know which one I'm gonna recommend they pay for. And recycling and composting take up a lot of time. If you want to do it effectively, it's a ton of time. And you also need to have access to the appropriate facilities and services. If you have a very demanding job or multiple jobs, you might just not have the possibility to recycle or compost. Do you know those like super practical little compost bin you have on your kitchen counter and that's so easy and everyone could have them? And have you ever thought about why you don't have one in your home yet? Yeah, they're super expensive. Compost is a lot of work anyway. If you have one in your garden, it's not just like throwing your garden scraps out there. It's work, and work takes time. Even staying up to date and informed about climate issues and the newest sustainable practices requires time, access to resources, and educational opportunities. And not everyone has the same level of access to environmental education and the internet. Just a fact. And then there's activism. And this one is personal. If I participate in a climate protest, if I participate in a climate protest, and for some reason there's an issue with the police, I'm probably gonna be fine. It will be uncomfortable, it will be scary, it might be terrible, but I probably will be fine. Meanwhile, if a person of color is next to me, they have a much higher chance to be on the receiving end of police brutality. And that is in literally any country. So, yeah, there's a sense of danger. Also, participating in protests often involves costs like transportation, taking time off work, and other expensive resources. Marginalized communities are often the ones most affected by climate change. And they're also the ones that have the least capacity to adapt or mitigate its effects. Efforts that focus on individual actions rather than systemic change may overlook our need for broader structural solutions that address these inequalities. Advocacy for policy change is often more accessible to people with financial resources, connections, and education. Many people in lower income communities may lack the means to effectively influence policy or advocate for systemic changes. Climate change is scary, but there is reason for hope. I genuinely do believe that we cannot save the world from going to shit, but we can try to keep it within bounds. And honestly, I think that's all we can do. So that's all we have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below with any questions, comments, and concerns you might have. At this point, I want to give a shout out to Alina, my co-writer and co-producer, who really helped me out with preparing this video essay. And I hope that everyone has a lovely day. Bye!